Jesus and his closest followers had been walking from the regions of Galilee, where Jesus did most of his ministry, to Jerusalem to observe the annual Passover holiday, Passover festival, Passover observance. This is more than just a walk across town. This is a walk of more than 2 or 3 miles. This is a walk literally through counties. Think about it now. Think about walking from Little Rock to Arkadelphia, walking out of Pulaski County, walking out of Faulkner County, Saline County rather, walking out of Hot Spring County, walking into Garland County, Saline County, Benton, Hot Spring County, Malvern, Clark County, Arkadelphia. This is more than just a 2-hour walk. The Passover was annually observed then, as now, by the Jewish community as a reminder that God delivered their ancestors from imperial tyranny, worker oppression, and ethnic bigotry and discrimination in Egypt. We read about that in the second book of the Bible, Exodus. Jesus lived when most people traveled by foot if you didn't have money enough to ride. And if you rode a footed beast. You did not ride a vehicle that was self-propelled, because there were no self-propelled vehicles then at the time. If you rode either atop a beast that had feet, or you rode in a vessel, a carriage, a cart that was pulled by footed vehicles. Most people could travel no faster than the foot could move. So Jesus and his disciples had walked south from the villages of Caesarea Philippi in the northern region of Galilee and had entered the region of Judea. The events of today's lessons occurred in Judea on the outskirts of Jericho. Jericho was an established city some 13 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Jericho was the site of a Roman fortress. Jericho was the place where Jesus confronted the Palestinian Jewish tax collector named Zacchaeus, who was the chief tax collector for the despised Roman Empire. He was the chief because he was over a contingent of tax collectors. And Jericho was not only where he had his headquarters, but Jericho was where the fort was. He could not only collect taxes, he could depend on the police to protect him. As Jesus walked with his disciples and the growing crowd leaving Jericho, by the way, Mark's gospel has this event with Bartimaeus occurring as they're leaving Jericho. Luke's gospel has it as they're going into Jericho. They both have Bartimaeus getting healed, but they have him on different sides of Jericho, either before or afterwards. I don't want you to think I missed it. However it happened, they walked past Bartimaeus, a visually impaired man who sat by the roadside and survived by whatever he could beg from travelers. He had not always been blind. Bartimaeus had not always been blind. How do you know, preacher? Look back on that passage where Jesus asked him, "What would you have of me?" And notice what he says, "My teacher, let me see again." This is not a man who was born blind. This is a man who had seen. This is a man who had known the beauty of sight and the blessing of sight and the power of sight, and had been able to do things because he could see. Because he could see, he could work. But in a world where if you cannot see, you cannot work, to be blind is to be out of work. Bartimaeus had not always been blind, and therefore he had not always been begging. Because presumably when he could see, he could work, and therefore he didn't have to beg. But Bartimaeus was there on the side of the road because something had happened in his life that had caused his sight to fail, and there his income power had failed. There was no Social Security disability for Bartimaeus. And the safety net that Bartimaeus and every other person who could not work had was charity. Would anybody care enough to help a man who couldn't see to get enough to eat, to get enough to live? You got to get the context right. You got to get the context right. There is Bartimaeus. And after Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was walking among the passing multitude, somehow he had heard about Jesus of Nazareth because the word had gone out that Jesus was a healer. After Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was walking among the passing multitude, he made a spectacle of himself. He started begging loudly. You know, we have problems with people who beg, but we especially have problems with people who make themselves obvious when they beg. Get out of my face. I don't mind you begging out of my sight, but don't beg so I got to see you. And if I can't avoid seeing you, don't beg where I got to hear you. And if I've got to see you and hear you, don't beg where I can't stop from hearing you. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then the text gets interesting. Others, I love this, others sternly ordered him to hush. Others, I'm going to get to that in a minute, sternly ordered him to hush. And when they sternly, you can imagine what sternly meant. You know, not shh. Not shh. Stop talking so loudly. You better shut up. You better hush. If you don't hush, we'll hush you. We're not having any of this today. You can't see now. You want something else to happen to you? You know how it is. We walking past, we going to Passover. We ain't studying you right now. Why are you going to be messing us up? Jesus is busy. Don't be bothering Jesus. You got to read the text carefully. But Bartimaeus wasn't having any. Son of David, have mercy on me. He got louder. In other words, I ain't scared. I'm blind. I can't run. If you're going to whoop me, you're going to whoop me. But I'm going to make Jesus know where I am. I'm going to have Jesus know where I am. I know I need help. And then Jesus stops. He doesn't stop because people tell him Bartimaeus is calling him. He stops because he hears Bartimaeus calling. Jesus stopped and ordered the man be brought to him. Bring him to me. And then the people who had tried to silence Bartimaeus changed their reactions at that point. Come on now. Come on now. Don't you see him? He calling you? Come on. It's all right. Church folk. Jesus asked the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus answered, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus then said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." The text states that the man regained his sight immediately. Notice something in the other passage in John's gospel where Jesus healed the man who was blind from birth. Jesus had to do something. He had to spit on the ground and make a paste and apply it to the man's eyes and tell him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. You recall that? In this situation, Jesus simply says, "Your faith has made you well," and according to Mark's gospel, immediately the man received his sight, and Jesus said, "Your faith has made you well. I didn't touch you. Your faith made you well." He said, "Go." The man didn't go. The man followed Jesus in Jerusalem. Instead of leaving, he joined Jesus along the way to Jerusalem. It's easy to see and to celebrate the healing miracle documented by this passage. It's easy to recognize the persistent and the dramatic way Bartimaeus made his plight known and pleaded with Jesus to have his sight restored. And we should celebrate God's presence and God's powerful ministry and mercy. We should celebrate and recognize the purpose and need for persistent prayer. At the same time, we need to see some challenging lessons that are inconvenient, if not uncomfortable, in this passage. This passage reminds us that in Jesus, God took up residence as healer in a suffering world. As healer in a suffering world. In Jesus, God did not come to the world as a conqueror, but as a healer. In Jesus, God did not come to the world as a capitalist who peddled access to health care for profit, but as a healer who provided care to anyone without charging anything, not even a copay. In Jesus, God came to the world as a healer who did not disqualify people with pre-existing conditions from receiving health care. In Jesus, God came into the world as a healer who did not require people who needed health care to be drug-free or to undergo drug testing. In Jesus, God came into the world as a healer who didn't force unemployed people off health care. Bartimaeus was unemployed. We have a governor who is throwing people off health care if they don't work. He calls himself a follower of the Jesus who healed unemployed Bartimaeus. Don't miss this. In Jesus, God walked as a disenfranchised person in our world of influence peddling politicians and preachers. God walked. Don't miss that. In Jesus, God walked with the disenfranchised. In Jesus, God didn't have a donkey. God didn't have a mule. God didn't have a stallion. God didn't have a chariot. God didn't have an ox-drawn cart to ride. In Jesus, God couldn't afford a donkey. He couldn't afford a mule. He couldn't afford a stallion, couldn't afford a chariot, couldn't afford an ox-drawn cart to ride. In Jesus, God walked as a preacher who didn't have his followers buy him a donkey, buy him a mule, buy him a chariot, buy him an ox-drawn cart. In Jesus, God didn't have his followers buy him a jet, a Bentley, Mercedes, even a Chevrolet. In Jesus, God walked because Jesus and God wasn't a temple preacher. He was out there with the multitude. In Jesus, God walked because Jesus was healing and teaching people, healing and teaching people, healing and teaching people who couldn't afford donkeys. He was walking to Jerusalem with other folks who were walking because none of them could afford donkeys and mules and stallions and chariots and carts. In Jesus, God walked in a world where empires sent soldiers to occupy people in other places by force and by threats of force. In Jesus, God walked among colonized people whose lives were controlled every minute of every day by displays and threats and acts by armed forces. In Jesus, God walked under the threat of violence from armed forces that were constantly ready to seize and to assault and imprison and kill anyone who descended from Roman supremacy, meaning whatever the Roman Empire did that they didn't like or represented. In Jesus, God walked along roadways where disabled and impoverished and disenfranchised people like Bartimaeus begged because they couldn't get the government, the empire, to do anything about the conditions of their lives. And the church folks let them out there on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, the politicians and the religious people were disregarding them, trying to silence them, and blaming them for their plight. You recall what happened when Jesus saw that man blind from birth. Question, Master, who sinned? Was it the man or his folks? In Jesus, God walked in our world alongside religious people like James and John. You recall James and John. They were two of the big three, Peter, James, and John, big three, right? They were tight, Jesus' tight buddies. When Jesus went anywhere, James and John and Peter were with him. Went to the top of Mount Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John were there. James and John had left the fishing work they had done with their father Zebedee to follow Jesus. And as they walked toward Jerusalem, what is not in this text is important. James and John, as they were walking toward Jerusalem, sidled up to Jesus and said, Master, we got something to ask you. What you want? When you get to Jerusalem, put us one on your right hand and one on your left hand. James and John asked Jesus to appoint him to leadership positions in the political empire they thought Jesus was going to set up after they reached Jerusalem. You understand, James and John thought Jesus was going to Jerusalem to start another government. Not just James and John. Read carefully this text. blind Bartimaeus addresses Jesus, son of David, not son of man, son of David. Son of David is the name that you give to the ancestral king. They expected Jesus to go into Jerusalem and set up the new empire. The Messiah notion of the people was he was going to run the Romans out of the government and take over. James and John wanted Jesus to become political insiders, and they wanted to be political insiders in Jerusalem. I suspect they had been present on that other occasion when Jesus healed an unnamed blind man who was blind from birth. But as Jesus walked along the road outside Jericho to return to Jerusalem for Passover, we do not read James and John doing anything to help Bartimaeus. Look at the text. Beyond the fact that these men who clamored for top positions with Jesus are not identified with any effort to help Bartimaeus reach Jesus, lies another troubling matter. Nowhere in any of the gospel accounts involving Bartimaeus do we read that James, John, Peter, or any of the other Jesus' top disciples did anything to help Bartimaeus reach Jesus. When we read at Mark 10:48 that many people sternly ordered Bartimaeus to stop begging for help, we can infer that Peter, James, and John were among the folks who were sternly ordering Bartimaeus to hush. James and John, who had sidled up to Jesus and wanted to be the top people in the new empire they thought Jesus was going to set up, would not help Bartimaeus. That's why Jesus had to call him, because James and John wouldn't bring him. So why would people who were the closest to the healing power of God, that was walking around in Jesus, try to prevent Bartimaeus from being healed? Why would people who had the most experience with the healing power of God, that was walking around in Jesus, believe that they were somehow being obedient to Jesus and the power of God by trying to keep Bartimaeus from being heard? Why was blind and impoverished Bartimaeus forced to scream for help? Because the people who were closest to Jesus tried to silence him and hush him. I warned you that these are inconvenient, if not uncomfortable questions. They become even more uncomfortable when we consider the plight of Bartimaeus in light of current events. I will go there. Yesterday morning, an armed man entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, by the way, is the most racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse community in western Pennsylvania. An armed man entered the Tree of Life Synagogue with an assault rifle. An assault rifle. He did it on Saturday morning, on the worship day of the Jewish people. According to the Washington Post, that man killed 11 people and wounded 6 others, one of them critically. He did it after shouting hateful statements concerning Jewish people. The man was arrested. According to an online article in today's Washington Post, that gunman is a white supremacist who has posted anti-Semitic messages on Gab, G-A-B. Gab is a social media platform hosted by and frequented by white supremacists. Some of his most recent Gab postings expressed hostility toward the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HAIS, one of 9 organizations that provides assistance to immigrants and refugees. I'm coming somewhere. We've got people walking from South and Central America trying to get into this country. And the leader of this country sends armed people down to the southern border and announce that he's going to do so. And then we have a fellow yesterday takes an assault rifle, armed rifle, and goes into a synagogue that is identified with helping immigrant people. Don't miss this. Don't miss this. Don't fail to connect the dots. It is connected. It is connected. That's not all. The same Washington Post article mentions that last week another gunman tried to enter Jeffersontown First Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Jeffersontown is a predominantly black church. When he found it locked, he shot and killed 2 black people who were shopping in a nearby grocery store. He's been charged with murder. The authorities are also considering charging him with a hate crime. You recall in 2015, 9 people were killed at African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina. That gunman was also a white supremacist. Charged, found guilty. He's sentenced now, serving 9 life sentences in prison. Earlier this year, February of this year, 17 students and teachers were killed by a gunman at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, an affluent suburb some 30 miles from Fort Lauderdale. All of these tragic incidents involved massacres of unarmed people in places they had a reason to believe they could be safe. School, church, shopping. Happened in a nation where people who call themselves evangelical followers of Jesus are opposed to governmental assault weapons bans. They're opposed to limits on governmental assault weapons. Do you hear me? They're opposed to bans on governmental assault on assault weapons. The James and John folks around here. Let's get this plain. The James and John folks, the folks who say they are close to Jesus, are saying, hush, when you talk about banning assault weapons. Hush. In recent weeks, a number of people incarcerated in Arkansas prisons have been found dead in their prison cells. Some of the deaths appear to have been from drug overdoses. Yet the people who call themselves evangelical followers of Jesus have been strangely quiet. They've been trying to hush the reports about the drugs that are finding their way into prisons that are now more and more privately run, where the access to the prison is controlled by private contractors who are paid by public dollars to keep folks from getting into prison who don't belong there, and keep stuff from getting into prison that doesn't belong there, and keep folks in prison getting out of there. The current versions of James and John and the other close disciples of Jesus are not making much noise. What are we doing? Are we trying to hush the voices of the people who need help? Our congregation is part of a community where people who call themselves evangelical followers of Jesus try to silence the pleas of families and students and teachers and other supporters of public education. Our teachers need help, and we cannot get the Peter and James and John folk to help our public schools. Are we trying to not hear their pleas? And when their cries are finally heard, are we like the people who tried to hush Bartimaeus, acting as if we wanted them to be heard all along? You recall after Jesus had called him, oh, come on up now. Well, preacher, where are you going with this? These are disquieting questions for us to learn from the account of Jesus and Bartimaeus. Perhaps the most disquieting lesson for us to take from this account is this: Bartimaeus was poor because he was blind. And he was blind because he did not receive healing. But the people who walked with Jesus with good vision were blind because they did not want him to be heard so he could be healed. Not all blindness is in the eyes. Let those who have ears hear the cries of our screaming, suffering neighbors. Let those who have eyes see and help our suffering neighbors receive the healing power they need. Then the world will know we're not only walking along the road with Jesus. Then the world will know we are in step with Jesus and in touch with the heart of God. Amen.